Hello everyone, we've got a pretty big topic for us this week, and that's systemic violence. And we've got a few different subtopics that we're looking at this week that all sort of hang off and connect to that concept of systemic violence. But let's start with the big one. Let's start with what that concept is all about. And this is based on the idea that not all violence occurs, and definitely not all harm occurs in ways that are directly and obviously perceivable. A lot of harm occurs in ways that are built into the system itself. So we definitely see violence when someone goes and hits someone else. We can see that cause and effect pretty clearly. But we're less able to see the fact that thousands of children die from hunger because the global economic system is set up in a way that they don't get food or they don't get medical attention. So it's been a way of broadening out the concept of violence studies to look at both some of those big systemic issues that harm people, but also the interconnection between different systems in society and other forms of violence. So we lead in the notes this week with a bit of a discussion of the three strikes rule in the United States, and how that led to mass incarceration and massive amounts of damage, particularly to the Black and Hispanic communities in the United States. And there's an example of something that not only is a systemic unfairness and systemically victimises individuals or part of the system, but it does sort of directly lead to further crime, because people who go into prison are more likely to come out hardened offenders and commit more offences and more violent offences than when they went in. So you see in that case a get tough on crime policy that just creates more crime, and is one of the largest failures of criminal justice policy that we've ever seen. Don't know whether we would want to try and compare it to transportation of convicts to Australia, but definitely in modern times, it has been a massive failure. And part of that massive failure of those law and order policies altogether, just generally. So when we're talking about systemic violence, we do open that scope for much broader discussion of how much violence is caused by the individual inflicting the violence, how much violence comes from the systemic factors that push that person in that particular direction, and how much is out there that we would not ordinarily classify as violence, people dying because they don't get the medicine they need. Maybe we should start classifying as violence. Now, not everyone agrees with that. Steven Pinker, who we looked at a couple of weeks ago, who did the Angels of a Better Nature, the history of violence, definitely doesn't agree with including that form of violence in the general concept of violence. And that's possibly due to the fact that his study was looking at historical and archaeological, anthropological evidence of violence throughout history. And it's very, you can see where a Paleolithic era person has been stabbed with a spear, because you can see the marks on the bones from a spearhead, but it's impossible to tell whether that person felt oppressed by the society they were living in. So I think part of Pinker's reluctance to recognise broader forms of systemic violence does come from his particular focus, which is that research into violence over time. So there's a lot of material on the notes. I won't go through it again. On Galtung, who was the sociologist who came up with the concept of systemic violence, and some of the broader consequences, and particularly as what I think is an interesting quote from Kurt Vonnegut that explains why people are complicit in systemic violence, where people will buy into a system that is not good for them, which is always the question. It's why do people buy into and resist changes to these dysfunctional systems? And Marx had a very eloquently defined sociological explanation for false consciousness, but I think Vonnegut as an author just expresses it a whole lot more neatly. All right. So the guided reading for this week is from Hannah Arendt, who is one of the 20th century's leading philosophers. Well, in my estimation, I guess, a lot of people's estimation. And the point that really made her career was as a Jewish German person. She's living in Germany. I'm not sure if she was German, but dealing with the legacy of the Nazis, and so many things that the Nazis did that were unthinkable, or people just didn't recognise happening beforehand. And she did work, and I've pointed to this in the notes, on the banality of evil, and the fact that evil is not something that runs around in a black cloak and cackles. That evil is your next door neighbour. It's a parent. It's a child. It's something that we can't stereotype. But her short book on violence, you've got one of the 3 chapters, so it's very, very short and definitely all worth reading. But she struggles with this idea of power and violence, and her concern that a lot of people on the left and the right together just use the word power when they mean force. And you'll see this throughout other readings as well. People say, "Oh, and this is just what power does," and power, destroys people. Power is violence. Power victimizes people. What Arendt wants to do in this chapter is to say, let's not conflate power with violence, and let's talk about power as a term of legitimate, popular or legitimate expression of sovereignty. So when someone is a legitimate representative of the people, they exercise power. But if they're acting outside that role, or they're not legitimate, then what they exercise is violence. So it's not a point of view that everyone agrees with, of course, because people still talk about power and violence being the same thing. But I thought it was a good thing for you to have a look at, because it was a very interesting perspective, and I also wanted you guys to read some philosophy, because part of this aim of this unit is for you to read about violence from different points of view and different perspectives. And I think this was a really good example of a philosopher who expresses herself very clearly. Originally had a reading by another philosopher about Arendt's work in the original version of the course outline, and you'll see I've changed it to the Arendt one, because the one I was thinking of using was actually much more opaque and confusing than Arendt's actual words. The person who did the summation and explanation of her work actually made it harder to understand, whereas I think her actual original work is quite beautifully expressed and quite eloquently done. So yes, have a look at Arendt, read some philosophy, embiggen yourself for the week, but I think that's a really good source to look at. Okay, so there's a bit of a section there that introduces systems thinking, that gives you an idea about. We're not going to learn all about systems thinking in a part of a week, but it is an important, when we're talking about systemic violence, we're talking about the justice system, the criminal justice system, to actually acknowledge that there is a body of thought out there about what systems are and how they work. So I thought it'd be good to have a little introduction there. And that leads us on to the idea of organisational conflict. So this is where we're trying to map conflict, not just in terms of person A versus person B, but in terms of these different pressures and flows and structures within an organisation. And there's a video there from Julie Hyde that's a rather neat little guide to how to map out those conflicts. And please watch that, because that's part of the workshop for this week. The challenge is to actually choose a hypothetical conflict and then use the tools that she does to map it out as a system, as a visual representation of what's going on there. And visual representations, of course, are simplifications. They're not going to tell the whole story, but they're a good tool to get us oriented towards agreeing or disagreeing on what's going on. And that's why, skipping to mediation, often mediators use whiteboards, because often that's the best visual way of people being able to perceive what's actually going on, and to break it down into its elements. Section 4 is about regulating conflicts. We have a bit of a case study on sexual harassment laws and look at the potential of law to, and law reform and just law generally as a means of dealing with systemic violence. So we had and continue to have, surprisingly enough, when you look at the media, a big problem with sexual harassment. But some major changes were made in Australia with the introduction of sexual harassment laws. And it's very interesting now to look back and to see how these laws, which at the time a lot of people said is going to be completely ineffective, there's no way you can change behaviour, have been quite effective in many contexts. Not in Parliament House, apparently. Apparently they have no impact at all on Parliament House, but your average workplace tends to observe those values a bit better these days. All right, so our challenges for this week. There's the organisational conflict mapping exercise I mentioned before using Julie Hyde's model. And then we're going to look at working on development of a conflict scenario. So this is where we're going to do a bit of a walkthrough on the first assignment and have a look at, and I refer you to the design kits, the assignment, everything else that's on Moodle there, to have a look at that first, and we'll get into that so that we'll have a, hopefully you're already thinking about your scenarios, but we'll have a go at in class working on one. All right, the last thing I wanted to talk about was to close the loop on the feedback, the check-in from last week. You might have noticed, I don't know if it hit you or not, but there was a brief introduction of a university-wide weekly survey thing, which they've now withdrawn, and they didn't tell us about it. So if you're confused as to why all of a sudden you're asked to do like weekly surveys and then they stopped, or maybe you guys didn't get them, I don't know. I've been told nothing. All I've been told is we're not doing them anymore. So yeah, if you're confused, I'm confused too. But please keep answering the check-ins, because unlike those broad tools that just say, did you like this unit or not, they're targeted to actually what the unit's about, so we can actually get a bit of a feedback on what your needs are. So I'm just going to have a quick little squiz at what the answers from last week's, or this week's, as they are when I'm recording this one. So we did have someone who's worked in. The first question was, have you been in a mediation? And only one of the respondents had some very good feedback on the mediation. Well, apparently at least two people have been in mediations, because someone felt very powerless during a mediation, and someone else felt very empowered by the mediator's role in that conflict. And I think this difference, it really shows the breadth of different experiences in the world where mediators are really unregulated. And there are a lot of people I know out there who are terrible mediators. People like former school principals, it's just like the worst profile to be a mediator, who decide they retire and they want to become mediators because they like telling people what to do, which of course is not what mediation is about. One person had a really good experience and really felt as though the mediator intervened in the right places to actually balance power, and that's a topic we're going to come back to in a bit of detail in a couple of weeks' time. And someone else felt powerless. So those were interesting observations. Majority of people were in support of me looking into mediator certification as an option. I really wouldn't look at the university making money out of it. I'd try to keep costs as low as possible. But it would be something like a weekend or a couple of weekends of sessions on top of what you've done in this unit, to be able to lock down an official mediator certificate. So I will continue to follow that up. I wasn't going to follow it up if everyone just said, nah, not really interested. But 80% were interested, so I will follow it up. And our last question, which is things to explain in more detail. Someone said NDA, non-disclosure agreements, and their legality. It's a little bit outside the scope of the course. I'll think about where it's relevant and where we might put something in, because occasionally the result of a mediation is people agree to sign some kind of contract. It might be a non-disclosure agreement, or it might be what was called a non-derogation agreement, which is basically, I'm not going to badmouth you after this is all over. The question is, how legal are those things? You really have to study contract law to get to the bottom of how legal those are. But I'll see what I can do. I'll see if I can find a little bit in there just to give you an overview of those. Quite often people try and get people to sign unenforceable agreements as a sort of a symbolic outcome. But the agreements, someone has to get something out of a contract for it to be binding. And if all you're doing is just agreeing not to talk to anyone, and you're not getting necessarily any benefit out of it, it's not binding. But yes, I will find a place to mention that in future weeks. And someone else said about the more detail between the line between arbitration and mediation, how to mediate a conversation without offering solutions. So again, that's something we will return to again when we look at mediation skills. And one of the temptations, like the aforesaid school principles, is you can see what you think is the right solution, which may indeed be the right solution, and it's just very frustrating that the parties just never get to it. So there's lots of ways you can try and subtly, and I think it's not just reframing, it's also when you do summaries, you can just sort of tilt the summaries that you do on the board towards, and it's many people would say that's a bad use of mediator power. But I've also said on mediations where there's like a really obvious example in front, and every time you ask a question you think, well, has anyone thought about this very broad context, and they just still keep talking about the same thing. And it is that terrible temptation and ethical question of how far do you push what you think is an obvious solution. Because there is a danger that if by you pushing what you think is an obvious solution, that they'll just go with what you want because they see that you're paying as a mediator. And then the mediation doesn't really work. And it may not hold once they're out of the domain of your charisma and your impact on them. So it has to be a solution they come to. And the question is, how much poking can you do to bring up something that's really, really obvious and this no one brings up, no one talks about. Anyway, we'll talk about that a bit more when we look at those mediation skills. All right, so thank you for your feedback. Please keep it up. It is very useful for me, and I hope it's useful to you to actually be able to have that interaction where you can ask for things, and I can look at where I can fit them in the material that I design. And I guess I'll better upload this. It's Friday. We're meeting again on Monday. We have to talk about public holidays on Monday too, because I had not looked at the calendar, and there are so many public holidays on Mondays. We have to figure out what we're doing, but that is a discussion for next week.